It's time to meet the panel. Omair Ahmad, the managing editor for South Asia at Third Pole. Hello, Omair.
Hi, Kat. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm delighted to say we're also joined by Rocha, who's the president of Periodistas por el Planeta. In English, that translates as Journalists for the Planet. They're an organisation of environmental journalists across Latin America. And Laura's currently a journalist at InfoBay in Argentina. Morning for you, isn't it, Laura?
Yes, morning for everyone, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. And thirdly, we've got Ishan Kukreti. Ishan's a freelance environmental journalist. He's based in India. Ishan was a finalist for the Thomson Foundation Young Environmental Reporter Award last year. Welcome, Ishan. Good afternoon to you.
Hey, good afternoon, Catherine. Lovely to be here.
Welcome, all of you. And thanks, as I say, thanks very much for joining us. Ishan, I want to start with you because I want to get really some idea of the big picture of what it's like out there for environmental journalists and generalist reporters as well, who are just trying to pitch environmental stories. How difficult or easy is it to get environmental stories commissioned in your part of the world? Do editors you approach care about the topic, do you think?
Okay. Yeah. So before I answer your question, I just want to apologize in advance. I've just returned from the mountain, and I'm afraid I've accidentally brought in some cold back with me. So any sniffles, coughs, sneezes, please don't mind.
Don't worry, you carry on.
Yeah. I think when talking about the ease or the difficulty in pitching environmental stories, I think it's important to understand that especially since Paris 2015, there's been a healthy blossoming of environmental organizations, news organizations in India, and I assume this would be the case across the world also. So now you have a situation where there are a lot of organizations which are looking at environment, solely environment, and then there are the general news media organizations which are also looking at environment. So it's in some ways this should mean that it's easier to pitch environmental stories just because there are more people interested in these stories. But at the same time, because there are more people involved in environmental reportage, it means that the quality of that reportage has gone up. So the ask is high too. So one has to keep in mind, and invariably journalists will fall into either of these two categories, where they're either pitching to a specialist environment organization, or they'll be pitching to a generalist news organization with an environmental story. And the rules and challenges for both of these, not really rules, but the challenges and the strategies to overcome those challenges are different for both of these places. So to answer your question shortly, yes, environmental pitching, environmental story acceptance rate has increased, but so has the challenges that come with it.
I mean, like all of us, I'm assuming you'd have had stories turned down, and it's a bit gutting at the time, but with the hindsight of taking yourself a step back, have you had stories turned down, and why do you think that was?
Yeah. I mean, I think a daily routine part of journalism is seeing your stories get trashed down, or are being asked to rethink about the story. And again, I think I would want to go back to that dichotomy of specialist organizations and generalist organizations in that sense. So I have had stories rejected, or I was asked to rethink about stories while I was pitching at places which are solely dedicated to environment. And usually those pitches were rejected, or were shot down because of the nature of these organizations, which is more specialized, more nuanced reportage, more insightful. So so I was working at Down to Earth, which is this one of the oldest magazines in India, dedicated to covering science, environment, and politics. And there we had this longest running joke that whatever story idea you might pitch, Down to Earth has already done it 10 years ago, right? So in that case, the pitching came to an understanding of what the organization has already covered, and then building on that, so that you don't end up sending in a pitch which is basically a reiteration of a story that was already done. Similarly, on the other hand, if you look at generalist organizations which are now devoting their attention to environment, they are mostly looking at stories which are topical, because they are working in that news cycle where topicality and time relevance is an important issue. So their stories have been rejected because they're not really in the news cycle that week or that month. So for that, to overcome that challenge, you have to sort of link it to something which is, link your story idea, environmental story idea, to something which is happening recently. And honestly, given the complex governance system, the academic system, and the knowledge production system around environment, it's not always very difficult to find a recent peg. And also I felt that while pitching at organizations which are not really geared into environment 24/7, it takes skill to be able to make the editor understand your point of view and make them understand how the various layers of the regulatory systems are functioning, and therefore your story is important. So sometimes my stories have also been shot down because I could not convey what the story meant because of all the complexities involved, and because I sort of took for granted some of the issues, thinking that the editor would already know them.
I think you've brought to the fore quite a lot of very interesting topics. Hopefully we can touch on them, but I wanted to pick up on what you said about recycling stories. I mean, the key thing is, if you've got something to say something new, bring something new to the table. Laura, can I bring you in here? Because Argentina, like many countries around the world, you've seen record heat waves this year. We've had them in the UK, they've been in India. When they happen, it's a big story, but then the news cycle moves on, doesn't it? So it's the same sort of question to you, really. How difficult or easy is it to get environmental stories commissioned in your part of the world? And are there particular issues in Latin America for journalists trying to sell environmental stories?
Yes, hi. I think that, as Ishan mentioned, one of the keys are the complexity. We are working with a kind of story that is very complex, and in a super connected and information-rich world, being able to pitch environmental news is very, very challenging. In Latin America, in particular, in countries with so many urgencies and needs, of course, as it happens in Asia, it is necessary to be able to make sense of the stories. While headlines about the climate crisis and its effects can always have repercussions, we have to continue talking about what is happening. It is necessary to go beyond that. So for some time now, editors have been interested in or giving more space to stories that connect the dots. That is, in which environmental and climate issues appear as causes or consequences, maybe, of gender, human rights, or quality of life issues. For example, the worst moments of the COVID-19 pandemic helped a bit in telling those kind of stories and relationships, for example. Scientific explanations began to talk about our relationship with nature. So going back to that narrative and taking it up again is very, very important. And I have, for example, another case when a demand for mitigation or adaptation policies that it's a really technical question in climate issues originates in a village, for example, in the Peruvian Andes. A couple of months ago, we learned that a farmer, Saul Yusha, sued the energy company RWE for being one of the biggest culprits of climate change, and a German court is analyzing the case right now. So I think that this kind of story generates a lot of attraction, and when you make that effort, you can also go beyond, the headline of the moment of the first site.
So they're really complex. We're talking particularly about investigative pieces, and I'm hoping at some stage today we'll talk about storytelling and how we can engage our audiences in these very complex stories. But just briefly, Laura, I mean, have you ever had to argue with an editor to get an environmental story commissioned? I mean, how do you approach it?
It's of course, I have to argue many times.
Who won the argument, dare I ask?
Yes, of course, but you'll be more success when you can explain the complexity. I think, as I mentioned, that the key is to explain the complexity. You have to understand very well what is happening, so we can tell the others what is happening, especially the audiences. And you have to relate, because at least in Latin America, maybe the people doesn't know that it's a consequence of or a cause of climate change. So you have to explain that, because maybe they live another kind of situations in their lives. They have other urgencies, economic, and of course, many crises that our countries go through. So, of course, that my argument is important to reflect that that reality or X reality, it's very related with climate crisis.
Thanks for that, Laura. And just a reminder to everyone listening, we want to hear from you with your questions. I'll be coming to some of those questions that are coming through very shortly. The DMs for Third Poll on Twitter are open, so please send those questions through. Omair, if I can bring you in, because you are an editor, you're the person that journalists like us are going to be pitching our environmental stories to. So to answer the question for this discussion, how to get your environmental story on the news agenda, how can journalists make that happen? I mean, how do you like to be approached?
Well, in one sense, for us, it's fairly easy. We are reporting on the environment, so it's not very difficult to get the environment on our news agenda. That said, I don't make the decision on my own. And at the Third Poll, we have a consensus-based decision-making where among 4 or 5 editors, at least 3 people have to say yes before we accept a story. So to a certain degree, we're pitching the story to each other. And the story that the journalists send, we adopt them usually. I mean, somebody says, okay, I really want the story. And I think this works, and this is high. Sometimes all of us want the story. It depends on how it goes. Sometimes we have a fairly split opinion about whether this story is able to tell an old story well, or a new story in a specific way. And I'll tell you the one thing that almost always makes the difference, and that is good data. So if somebody is saying, okay, I have this thing to say, our first question will always be, do you have the documentation to support it? How current is the documentation? How reliable is your data source? And do you have more than one data source or just one data source? That will be at the heart of our reporting, because credibility is really, that's everything for journalism. And you have to be able to convince your audience that what you're saying is backed up. And that will be, I'll stop there. We can continue about other stuff, but to me, that is gold. Data is everything.
So staying credible, having evidence to back you up with. But I just want to briefly pick up on something you said, because it's something Ishan said at the start, that we are seeing there are a lot of specialist environmental journalism sites now. Is there a danger it just might become a niche part of journalism? What should journalists do who are working for a general news outlet to get their story up the news agenda? Do you have any sort of advice, tips for them? Should it be the same approach? Should they just go with a really well backed up, credible story?
I think a well backed up, credible story is actually the most important thing, whether you're going to a specialist website or you're going to a general website. If I read even in a general website some strong pronouncement, and I look into it and the sources are not there, or the sources are weak, or it's just based on unnamed sources who saying on the condition of anonymity, 1 or 2 unnamed sources, okay. But if it's all unnamed sources, that's not a good piece of journalism. It doesn't matter if it's an environment site or any other. It lacks credibility. But actually, to answer the larger question, journalism is about holding power to account, to basically show the general public how things are happening and why. Why are big decisions being made that impact your life? And that, whether you do it through environment or through any other point of view, is is the core of what we do. And I think what we're seeing, I mean, if you look at the crises that are emerging these days, whether it is economic crises, the crises of, of massive inequality, the crisis currently in the Russian-backed Ukraine war, so many of these have both environmental drivers, energy drivers, and energy and environment impacts. So I would suggest that actually we're now much more bleeding into each other. Environment news is far more linked to what's happening in the hard politics world than we honestly acknowledge.
I think you're
And
right. I think
sorry, go on.
sorry, Omair. I was going to say, I think you're right. It touches on every beat in the newsroom. And in fact, we've got a question now from Janani, a writer and photo storyteller that sort of gets to the heart of the training courses, and I think gets to the heart of this discussion, really. The question is, how can we pitch the national level environmental stories? Sometimes we get feedback that it's not for the regional audience. However, it directly or indirectly impacts us all. Janani would like to learn more. I mean, to me, that comes under a heading, really. How do you make the global story matter at a local level? And how do you make a local story matter at a global level? To me, that comes down to sort of making your stories interesting. So if you're pitching a story, you want to grab the commissioning editor's attention, what would your advice be? Laura, I wonder if I could come to you first for this, because you were an expert in the Thomson Foundation environmental training courses where we talked about this, and you've already mentioned connecting the dots, so connecting the national level to the regional. Just explain a bit more what you mean. What should reporters be doing? What do you mean about connecting the dots?
Well, I think that I have to mention that, for example, in climate crisis and climate change, it's a local problem with international solution, maybe, or with local solutions, and that many local governments can do a lot about what is happening. So I don't think that it's a disadvantage. I think that we have to take advantage to that kind of solution, maybe. I don't want to say or to write about solution. Catherine, we discussed this many times about solutions and journalism of solutions, because, of course, that the crisis we are going through doesn't depend on just everyone, but it's a collective solution. But I think that connecting the dots, it's about, find the relationship between what is happening and your own life, and of course our life in general. Right now, we are facing, for example, in the north hemisphere, big heat waves, especially many of you that are in Asia also suffered the climate crisis a few months ago. And of course, that it's very related with all the world. We are, that kind of phenomenon. It's also tracking the ice of the Arctic, and also the life of birds, and biodiversity, and the economic activities during the crisis that is happening for the war in Russia. So everything is connected, and also is connected with oil prices, with commodities prices. So there are so many things, and it's so complex, as Ishan mentioned. And of course, Omar said, when you have big data, and you have plenty of data of that kind of things, your story will be more powerful. So I think that you have to connect the dots, but of course with data, not only speculating, and many local solutions can be a great story to tell the audience.
We will, thanks for that, Laura. We will come to solutions, I think, but not just yet, because Ishan, I just want to pick up what Laura said about, the heatwave story. It is a global story. It's also very much a local story. We spoke about this, didn't we? Because it's an example you've got of how you took this global story and made it relatable at a local level. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about the story you did about the heatwave in India and finding a new angle.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So I think what both Laura and Omair are talking about in terms of joining the dots in different, either thematically or across spatial differences, global, local, regional. I think that is the job of the journalist to act as the bridge between these various forms of knowledge production, whether it's policy making, which is happening mostly at the central level, or international scientific bodies which are working at the international level. And it's our job to to be the bridge between all of these, and to see how IPCC reports or a particular policy in the center or at the federal level is going to impact a poor village in some mining area of the country. Talking about that heat wave story, so what I did with that heat wave story was that everybody was talking about heat waves, and everybody was talking about the impact on agriculture. And I mean, Laura also mentioned this. I mean, we have had these problems for a really long time in this part of the world. In the developing world, we floods, heat waves, all of these things, although their intensity and frequency are increasing, but we have had these problems for a really long time. What with climate change, what we get, and the added responsibility that we get as journalists is to talk in this new language of climate change and talk about all the other regulatory mechanisms which come with climate change and the accountability mechanism which come with climate change. So for that heat wave story, what I did was that I did report that the intensity of the heat wave was unprecedented. Everything that went along with it, the loss in crop yields, all of those things. But what I also talked about was that that failure of wheat crops across India, and that unprecedented amount of heat, was what it was saying was that we need better climate finance. We need better resources from the developed world to fight all of these problems. So in that sense, it was a national story. I was able to connect the national and the international, and make it a story about the developing world and the need for climate finance to deal with this unprecedented crisis of climate challenge that we have today.
Thanks for that, Ishan. So yeah, it's connecting the dots, Janani. I hope this sort of answers your question really, and even if you want to get a sort of a local angle on a national picture, it's finding a great case study. A great case study is a really effective storytelling way into the bigger picture. It also helps connect you to your audience. And talking of audiences, because they are really central to our environmental training courses at the Thomson Foundation. Omair, I wonder if I could bring you in here, because we did speak briefly about this earlier. Is this one way to interest an editor? If you understand the readership of your publication, your story is going to connect better with that audience. Is that right?
That I would suggest that anyone who's pitching a story, please read what that publication is publishing, right? You'll get a pretty good idea of what they're interested in. Just scroll down the top 10 stories that they have on their website, and you'll have an idea. I mean, this, of course, does not work for generalist publications such as, Deutsche Welle, Guardian, or BBC, or stuff like that. But if you're looking at more specialist publications, or if you're pitching and you know the editor, or you know the name of the editor, Google them, find out what they've written, and you'll get an idea also what their interests are. And that's one way of engaging. Don't be a stalker. That's not cool. But generally, I mean, one of the things that we unfortunately often get environment stories pitched from outside our geographic area. And I'm happy to explain to the person pitching the story that, hey, this doesn't really fit because this is what we do, and this is not part of that. But and that's sometimes an honest mistake. It's a mistake you don't have to make. You just have to look at the publications and look at that. And in terms of what will appeal to their audiences, again, the top stories on that on that publication's website will show you who they're trying to reach out to. That doesn't mean you have to copy paste those particular things, but it'll give you an idea.
Thanks for that, Omair. Actually, we've got a question here from Val, who's Executive Director of the Association of Young Environmental Journalists, that relates specifically to audiences. Val wants to know, how do we ensure environment stories are more palatable for younger audiences, age 22 and below, especially as some of them are tired of sad and bad environmental news? I think that touches on solutions, which we will come onto in a minute. But in terms of younger audiences, I think that's the million-dollar question that news organisations across the globe are trying to tackle, how they can make any story more palatable to a younger audience. In particular, in this instance, environment stories. I mean, my top advice would be know what they're expecting and what platforms they're on. I wonder if any of the three of you could come in here. How do we ensure, or how do we try and make environment stories more palatable for younger audiences? What do you think? Does anyone want to pitch in?
I could go if that's all right.
Ishan, yes, because I think when we spoke about audiences, you said how important it was to the pitching process, and it's something that you do, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. It's. I think Umair has already talked about it, that at least you should know what the publication is writing about. You cannot just simply pitch something. But in terms of making content more interesting for younger audiences, I just want to say one thing before I answer the question, is that this healthy blossoming of environmental news organization is, I believe, partly driven by the youth's needs to youth's consumption of news, which is very different from older audiences. And surveys after surveys have thrown up this data that younger people are more interested in knowing about the environment, about climate change. So I think you already have their attention. They're already looking at you, trying to listen to what you're trying to say. And so then your job is to just make the news story not so dull that the reader dies on the story. So for that, I think the most important thing is to to write a story and not a report, which is a problem with a lot of people out there. I mean, without really breaking down the various technicalities and complexities of the issue, you just assume that the reader would know everything, and then you bombard them with information. So that is one, to not make the story more sort of simplistic, but to try and explain everything in a proper lucid fashion. And then I think because environment, I think as Omair was saying, that it bleeds into other areas also. It's great to sort of find these linkages with other avenues, other beats, other avenues of life, where you can make environment not something which is which is something very exotic and something which is happening thousands of miles away in exotic locations like the Himalayas, but something which is happening and unfolding right in our backyards, right across the street where we live in. And to do that, environmental reportage provides a great opportunity, because environment brings together environmental law, environmental sciences, the sociology of it. And there are a lot of subjects that you can jump from one subject to the other while telling a story. And I think for me personally, and I also think that as a reader also, the great stories are those which sort of which jump between the natural sciences of things and the social sciences of things. So to tell the story, let's say of an extinction, or a wiping out of a species in some ecosystem, and then linking it to how it impacts the people there, and maybe livelihoods, and then maybe coming closer to the reader, which might be an urban reader, and how it might impact them, would create more relatable content on which you can engage the reader for a longer duration of time.
I think you've touched on something key there, Ishan. Thank you for that. Environment does touch on every beat in the newsroom, from the sports desk covering, reporter covering dried out cricket pitches. Well, why are they dried out? Well, it's the impact of climate change, to fashion writers looking at sustainable clothing, and a health reporter looking at the impact of air pollution. So I think when it comes to issues for younger audiences, it's certainly not dumbing down content, but presenting it in a different way that might be more palatable to them, even if it's rethinking how you might do a 1,200 word feature article, for example, how you might present that in bite-sized chunks, whether it's sort of a Q&A session, which might be more appealing to a younger audience. So it's just sort of experimenting, I think, Val, and looking around at what other organisations are doing to attract that younger audience. But I think we've all mentioned along the way the S word, solutions. Solutions journalism, it's this sort of buzz phrase of the moment. I wonder whether journalists should be offering solutions with their stories. Laura, what do you think about this? Should when journalists are pitching an environment story, and a lot of them can appear quite apocalyptic, should they be offering solutions as well?
Yes, maybe. Can I mention or can I say something about younger audiences also?
Yes, of course.
And
Yes.
of course, I jump on your question after that. I believe that younger audiences are the ones who demands this type news the most. Because, as Ishan said, they are very, very interesting in that kind of issues. But what I think that we need to start looking is how to tell these stories to these kind of audiences, because the real challenge for us, at least here in Latin America, is to bring these audiences closer to the traditional media. They don't use traditional media to have their information. So I think that changing the narratives and bringing this type of news also generates a new challenges, because we have to be very creative to generate those pieces of communications to reach the younger audiences. There are many examples in Latin America. Here in the audience is Fermin Kopp from Diálogo Chino, for example. They make many, many examples with big data and with interactive maps and, with very interesting and colorful pieces, especially not in the traditional media, but in the web pages or maybe specialized sites and newsletters that brings them a different kind of information and a different approach to the climate crisis issues. I think that it's very, very important because, as I mentioned, and as many studies, for example, the Reuters studies this year shows that the younger people are using other kind of media. So if we want to reach them, we have to adapt, because if not, we are talking to the traditional audiences, and are very different, and they have another, kind of interests. And right now I am talking about solutions. I don't like, as I told you before, Catherine, and in the other course, that solutions will not be found on an individual scale. The possible solutions to the climate crisis are collective solution, in which we must all participate. And when I say everyone, I mean every country in the world. Of course, that the degrees of responsibility, and okay, the Paris Agreement talk about that very clear. But of course, that if we do not all have the same commitment, the crisis will only get worse. So, okay, yes, it's a challenge not to be apocalyptic, but the IPCC has been warning for decades that this is going to happen. And right now, we are realizing that it's going faster than the studies prevent. So I think it's time, to face what is happening and to say, of course, there are many, I don't know if jokes, but of course, the sense of humor maybe sometimes is the best way to communicate. I will mention again the heat waves, but when you are talking, for example, of what is happening in Britain and in Europe, you say, okay, there it's hot, and this is the new normal world, the new normality. But it's not the new normality. The new normality will be worse. So maybe we have to work with that, and of course that we have to work about what are we talking when we mention solutions.
Thanks for that, Laura. Yeah, I think you're right, and I think maybe constructive journalism might be a better phrase to use. Omair, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'll just let you know we're going to go to we're going to hear from a speaker after I've spoken to you, Omair, called Varsha. So Varsha, bear with us for a couple of moments. Omair, I just want to talk to you about solutions journalism, because it is this sort of buzz phrase. Is it too simplistic? And in particular, because I imagine there's journalists listening to this whose inboxes are full of PR press releases from companies claiming to be doing X, Y, and Z. What should they be looking out for in terms of greenwashing? And, you know, is there such a thing as good and bad solutions journalism?
Well, there's certainly good and bad journalism. And I think that itself is the question that you ask, is this good journalism? If something comes across and you find out that people are planting watermelons in riverbeds across South Asia as a way to adapt, that is definitely a solution. It's also in response to a larger problem. And you have to do all of that for it to become a good story. It's sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to interrupt you there, just to say, as an editor, does it make the story more palatable for you if there is a solutions element to it?
What makes it actually more palatable is if the person has actually talked to the people around. That is one of those things that is a sensibility. So if there's a problem, it's usually an imbalance between what was happening earlier, and the new, I won't even say a new normal, I'd say the new abnormal. And so in a sense, quite often people also offer, if you're talking to them, if you are doing a good job as a journalist, they will often sometimes say, oh, this should happen. And then you have to ask the next question, why doesn't this happen? Every story you do will be a complicated story. And, when I started out as a journalist, the one thing I realized that only about 10% of what I learned in a story ever got into print, because I couldn't put on the whole story. And that's often a disappointment. It's often a frustration, but you have to do that 100% to get that 10% out. I'm wary of solutions journalism. Sometimes we've been asked to do it. We've got funding to look at what are successful adaptation measures. But even when we commission these stories, we're always asking the question, are these actually sustainable? Are they actually dealing with the whole set of problems, or are they just dealing with a symptomatic thing? And all of I'm happy to say most of our journalists that freelance and write for us will try to look at it from as many sides as possible. I'd add one thing actually to Val's question about audiences and younger audiences. It's kind of, to me, it's a important question, but it has a somewhat simple answer, which is, if you want to have any audience, whether it's young people or women or indigenous communities, well, get them to report, help train them up, get their voices onto the page. People are interested in reading about what's happening with other people like themselves. All reporting doesn't have to be stodgy old men like me saying something, right? It should be a lot more of the world. The world is not just stodgy old men. So, mix it up.
I think you're absolutely right, Omair. I mean, my advice would be when you write any story or when you're planning to write any story, look at it and just ask yourself whose voice is missing, and then go and talk to them. Because the chances are it will be someone whose point of view has never been heard before, and it will make your story more interesting. Thanks for that, Omair. Let's bring in Varsha. You've got a question you want to ask Varsha. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So I was wondering, where can I find, list of organizations, maybe internationally or even like from South Asia, that works on the issues that are intersection of environment, climate plus social issues. So is it like they're doing some research or NGOs doing some work in that area so as to find the story ideas?
Varsha, you kept breaking in and out there, but you're asking where you can find lists of organizations who deal with environmental stories. Was that it?
Issues they are working on the environment, intersection of environment and social issues. These organizations may be like they're doing research or NGOs, they're working on ground for to get story ideas basically.
Okay, so you want to know where you can find sort of lists or helpful guides to people who are working in the environmental field who might give you stories. Well, Varsha, which part of the world are you calling us from?
I'm from India, so I will concentrate on South Asia or India mostly.
Great. Ishan, if I can put this story to you then, I mean, where do you get your stories from? Are there sort of useful lists, organizations you can call on to sort of help give you story ideas?
I think Varsha is asking for my sources.
Yeah, just keep it general. You don't have to give out phone numbers.
Yeah. No, so Varsha, there are organizations at the central level. So there are a lot of government bodies which keep publishing reports, right? So if you talk about biodiversity, then the Wildlife Institute of India or the ICFRE. There are various bodies which which deal with which have a mandate to deal with environment. So and they keep bringing out reports frequently about various issues. So one way to sort of find a story is to look at those reports and then work your own mind to think what impact or what ground level developments these reports might point to. Then there are academic and think tank organizations which again continuously bring out reports, and these reports are more along the lines of broader changes and their intersections with society and with the biological world. So so organizations like CSE, CEW, CPR, there's a whole range of it. So you can look at those. In terms of grassroots level organizations, I don't know where you are based, but I'm sure even if you'll find a lot of these organizations in the area that you're based out of. I would say a good practice is to look at a report by a central government or one of these think tanks, and then take that data or that inference that report is talking about to the local level and see whether how the processes that a central level report is saying is unfolding in your own backyard or in some rural area which really doesn't have any say in the mainstream media, and where you can bring these voices to the front within the context of the developments that these reports are talking about. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so what happens is this organization like Wildlife India or this IIT Guwahati, their websites are not updated many times, and you need to keep calling them and fill it in with the communication like PR contact. So
Usually most of these organizations also have a PR department. So if you send them your email or if you talk to somebody there, they'll keep you updated about the latest reports, latest research, all of those things.
And you can also, of course, contact most of these organizations via social media. Varsha, thank you for your question. We have to move on, I'm afraid, but I do want to pick up, you mentioned PR, Varsha, and we have had a question. This puts the other question. This is from Sabuhi, a comms professional working with a non-profit on climate change. How can we pitch stories on our work to the media? Now, this is interesting because a lot of journalists, we were just talking about story ideas. We will get press releases, emails, calls from non-profits working in climate change or working in the field of the environment, trying to sell us a story. And I am sure, like many others there, I mean, sometimes you hit delete, sometimes you think, oh, that looks interesting. So what is it that sort of, what should they be doing? And Laura, you must have over the years had countless emails from non-profits, from PR companies looking to sell you their environmental story. What makes you interested?
First of all, I have to mention that PR and journalist or maybe comms specialist that works with NGOs or with any kind of association or company or entity have to know who is the journalist that he or she are talking to, because there are many, at least in Latin America, but there are many of situations that the people who is who have to prepare that kind of information don't know what are the journalists that are doing that. So I think they have also to specialize, as we do specialize ourselves. But that it's a very good insight from your side, Catherine, because there are not so many specialized PR companies that works with NGOs and the list of possible sources that Basha wanted to have. So I think that we have to have a better relationship with NGOs and other entities, but in my opinion, they have to specialize in environmental crisis, especially to know who are you talking to.
I think you're absolutely right, Laura. I think the best thing you can do really is develop a relationship with one or two key journalists that you can send your story to. We're getting a few more questions come in, which I'll come to shortly. But I wanted to just bring in something that particularly freelance journalists are on the line here that can be a real problem for freelance journalists. And it's a worldwide problem with freelance payments and delays for journalists being paid for their work. I wonder if that should factor into the pitching process. It can be quite embarrassing for some people to talk about money. Omair, we've spoken about this. What do you think journalists should be asking for when they pitch an environmental story in terms of payments and what have you? And when's the best time for them to ask?
I think actually they should ask right up front. If the organization doesn't mention how much they're paying, in our case, it's fairly straightforward, and we tell people that we pay about $350 for a general tech story and more for multimedia and investigative, depending on the story. But generally, I mean, I'm very embarrassed when it comes to talking money. So this is advice that I can give because I will probably have great difficulty taking it. But ask the question, how much am I going to be paid for this story? When will I get paid? And sometimes, as happens, since we're a slow news organization, we're like more into deep stories. So we'll have a story that'll come in and we'll want to take a month or so on it. In which case, please ask, when can I get paid for this? Do I have to wait a month? Or can you pay me once you make sure that my facts and things are done and my side of the thing is done, and it's actually your editing process that's slowing it down? Please ask. Money, I mean, you should not be embarrassed for asking about money for your labor. the only people who should ever be embarrassed are people who delay paying people for their labor. That is the bottom line. That should be true across the board. Unfortunately, we know it's not true. Uh, I I can't say anything except I feel incredibly ashamed of my fraternity when I hear reports about this.
Thanks very much, Emma. It's always worth talking about when freelance journalists are involved. So thanks for that bit of advice. We have got time for probably a couple more questions. So the DMs are open for the third poll. I just want to pick up on something that we talked about earlier about data and false information. So when you're pitching a story to an editor, particularly if it's an investigative piece, you're likely to get a question from the editor: how sure are you this is true? You know, false information is rampant online. So I wonder, this is the question to the panel, how important it is really to tell your audience where you get your information from. I mean, Omair, we've just heard from you, but I wonder if you could go back. Is that something you look for in a story that's packed with information? Do you think, okay, if we print this, are we going to get into trouble? Where's this information come from?
It's not so much about are we going to get in trouble for printing verified information, uh, but every time, in fact, as part of our pitch form, we say what is your data and what is your data sources. I know that some people hesitate because, unfortunately, some less than ethical organizations will take such a thing and make it into a story themselves and not pay the journalist. Um, and that is a problem. It's a problem we acknowledge, and we try to figure it out by talking to journalists and making sure that they have the access to that data before we commission it. But unless unless something is backed full source. So sometimes somebody will say something on the condition of anonymity, and in certain cases they cannot you cannot publicly state that. Uh, we will say, okay, can you at least give us a designation or a general thing? Where is this coming from? And do you have other things that will back up this particular argument, which are open source and people can check? Any journalism that cannot be checked is not journalism. It is merely gossip. And that is a bottom line for us. We will never publish something that cannot be checked by the person reading it. The Our reader is somebody we respect, and I will say that to all journalism: respect your readers, right? Think of your readers like your friend or your family that you're talking to over a dinner table. Hey, I found out this, and so told me, or I read this in this particular report from this organization. Uh, you won't. I mean, if one of your if you're having dinner or drinks with some of your friends and you say, hey, did you know that this species went extinct because of a crazy tea plant that I imagine, your friends will laugh at you, and unless you can prove it somehow. It's the same thing. You respect your friends, you respect your family members. It's not that they doubt you, but you should be able to back up what you're saying. Otherwise, you lose respect with them in the same sense you would lose respect with readers if you don't back up what you're saying.
And following on from that, because we're nearly out of time now, but Laura and Ishan, I wonder if part of that as well is countering this sort of false information that's rampant online, is being open and transparent, and crucially presenting all sides of a story. Is that something, Laura, that do you always sort of go the extra mile to do, and journalists looking to pitch stories should be doing?
Yes, of course, Catherine. It's a bit that we have only a few minutes, but I think that what Omair is saying, it's pretty interesting, because of course it's I mean mandatory to have that quality of information, because I think one of the biggest challenges we are facing right now, especially on environmental issues, is misinformation. So that is why it's essential to have reliable sources, because right now misinformation is not like in other times that you have, for example, lies or something that it's changing all the narrative, but you have, for example, half true and half a lie, and maybe some audiences cannot difference, cannot, you know,
Differentiate.
Exactly. So we have to help them to have the better information that we can have in our hands, because right now social media, of course, WhatsApp and every media, maybe someone or some media outlet is also spreading that kind of information that have, for example, false information. So I think that it's a big challenge for us to fight misinformation right now.
Thanks for that, Laura. And finally, Ishan, if I can just go to you, about presenting all sides of the story. Is that one of the key things? We mentioned about missing voices earlier, but it's all to do with being open, transparent, and giving all information. So how important is it to you, really, to give all sides of the story?
Yeah, definitely. Giving all sides of the story is important. But having said that, I mean, practically, a lot of times what happens is that you cannot put everything into your story because of space constraint. So you have to make a judgment and an editorial call what will go into the story and what will remain out. I mean, obviously, it goes without saying that you have to have your facts right based on credible sources. But just to give another perspective to something that Umair says, and I know we're running out of time. I'll quickly wrap this up. Is that so? He mentioned that even if it's unnamed source. He would or his organization would ask for designation, and I have faced the same thing with a lot with many editors that they need something to identify the source by, and a lot of times you do not want the source to, even the identity of that source within the organization to be revealed, because it might end up costing him his job. So there was a story that I did recently where one of my sources told me that the Indian government was claiming to have done plantations over water bodies over Indian Ocean. I mean, that was enough to sort of run with the story and just use anonymous quotes. But I encountered the same problem where the editor was insistent that I should mention at least something about the source, and because I could not do it, I went back and I filed free information transparency applications, and I was able to get much more out of that. And then than just just an anonymous quote. So I think there are, as reporters, not as editors, I think we need to sort of figure out different ways to substantiate an unnamed source, not just by saying that okay, he belongs to this organization, blah blah blah, working there for a long time, but we can do other stuff, more rigorous stuff to sort of increase the credibility of the information.
Ishan, thanks very much. And sadly, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us for this Twitter Spaces event from the Thomson Foundation and Third Pole. Thanks too for your great questions. Apologies for those that we didn't get to. I will have a look through them later and try and reply to them individually. And of course, thanks to our panel, Rocha, Ishan Kukreti and Omair Ahmad. And a final reminder that our 3 free environmental reporting training courses can be found on our website, thomsonfoundation.org. And the best of luck to all of you pitching your stories. From me, Catherine Mackie, goodbye.